Hi, and welcome to episode 96 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada.
I'm Heidi Parker. I'm a postdoc at the University of Texas at Austin.
Hi, I'm Tom Housley, and I'm a postdoc at the University of Exeter in Penryn.
And this week, we're talking to somebody who came to our attention a couple of weeks ago for a political editorial, but who turns out to be doing a whole lot of really interesting stuff that is very, very relevant to our podcast. And I think everybody is going to enjoy listening to this discussion. And that's Dr. Travis Longcore, who is an assistant professor of architecture, spatial sciences, and biological sciences at the University of Southern California. Welcome, Travis. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
It's our pleasure. Can you tell everybody? Obviously, you have a lot of departments in your title there. Can you tell everybody at home how you do what you do and how it meets all those different departments?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that I have this title of, one of them of being professor of architecture, and the thing is, the only architecture class I actually took was architectural drawing in high school. And so what I have to do is explain to people that we have a landscape architecture program at USC, and I am to landscape architecture sort of what a structural engineer is to architecture. In other words, if people are going to build landscapes, design landscapes that are going to function as ecological entities, they probably need some background and expertise on the way that landscapes and species and habitats work. And so that's my role in the program and in the school. And my appointment is split 50-50 with the Spatial Sciences Institute, which is a standalone institute here at USC that sort of is the new geographers, as it were. And we have a number of programs, including some interdisciplinary programs that I'm involved with. One is a master's in Geographic Information Science and Technology, a GIST degree that's delivered basically all online, except for the 1 week we force people to come to an island off the coast of Southern California and learn how to use some tools. And then also an undergraduate major called Geodesign, a Bachelor of Science in Geodesign, and that's delivered as 1/3 planning, 1/3 spatial sciences, and 1/3 architecture. So trying to develop some skills that look toward not just diagnosing the problems of the planet, but figuring out and training people to try to solve them, and solve them in a science-based way that's also incorporates the multitude of options that are available when you start talking about design. So that's, and I have a courtesy appointment in biology because even though I am trained as a geographer and have 3 degrees in geography, I caucus with the ecologists and end up going after some things where it wouldn't make sense to folks if I didn't also have a little affiliation, with biology.
That's pretty incredible. I think it gives you a lot of freedom. When I look through your publication list, the species, you've done butterflies, you've done birds, you've done beavers, and a lot of times in your papers there are many, many species, but also the habitats vary so much. Is that just because of your collaborations, or is it something like, is there something that you specialize in or prefer?
Right. So, one of the things we're supposed to learn how to do when we apply for jobs is to sort of package yourself as an expert in something. And so and so I'm not a very good biologist. That's the thing you need to know. I mean, this is breaking bio, right? So let me just be clear here. If I were a good biologist, I would have a study system that I stuck with, and that was what I worked on, and I would be pushing the limits in that one study system. But my organizing principle is really around cities and urban and urbanizing landscapes, and the things that we do in them that affect other species. And so that leads to things like, and of course, the truth is sometimes when you work for 15 years as I did on soft money, you end up being a little opportunistic once you get going on something. So the butterflies that I work on, despite the fact a few of them are rural, many of them are in very urban habitats. And if you look at the endangered butterflies in California, over half of them are in what I would consider to be urban or industrial landscapes. And things like beavers or things like tower kill and artificial lighting and whatnot, these are all kind of stitched together through the idea of looking at how cities and human activities and edge effects are affecting other species. And so the way I try to convince people that I have a coherent research agenda is, and they better not watch this now, is, well, it's true. I mean, I have actually thought about this, is sort of looking at cities and ecology in cities, right? And this is not my distinction. You know, other people's have made this as well. So ecology in cities, you know, the species, the native species that sort of persist and what we do to them. Ecology of cities, so some concern about stormwater and runoff and sort of the way in which the city itself works as a landscape, and what you need to do to manage that. And also the sort of past, present, and future, right? So I look to historical ecology as a way to understand what the future might be for restoration in cities. And so I hope that within that sort of umbrella, all these sort of things fall out. And yeah, I do collaborate quite a bit because you know, there are people who know more than you always, and it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to work with them if it gets the job done.
Yeah, I'm sure you learned some amazing new skills and things along the way, or, you know, about all these different species as well. You've also worked on some restoration projects. Is there one that, you know, you were most excited about, or that's turned out really well?
Sure. Yeah. So prior to and actually continuing on, and because I'm in a professional school, it's okay to have a practice. And so the Urban Wildlands Group is a nonprofit that my wife and I, Catherine Rich, and I founded when we were both in grad school, and we continue to work on sort of applied issues there, the sort of stuff the university isn't necessarily interested in doing. And so one of them, we did a restoration project for the El Segundo blue butterfly, which is, if you've ever flown in or out of Los Angeles, you flew over the El Segundo dunes, which was at one time the sort of the remaining habitat of this species. And I was down at the southern end of the Santa Monica Bay, which is the bay you fly out over when you leave Los Angeles, and looking northward, and saw that there was this whole set of bluffs and slopes that had ice plant all over them. And ice plant is an introduced species here. I like to call it ecological styrofoam because it really doesn't do any good for anything but takes up space. And thought, if we replaced a bunch of this ice plant with native plants, we could maybe reintroduce butterflies here. And ended up getting connected with a local person who was actually a marine biologist, but who lived locally, and we put together this thing called the Beach Bluffs Restoration Project. And as that was just getting started, the county came to us and said, yeah, you guys work on doing some restorations on some other species. Can you put native plants back at this spot where we have to disturb it in order to build some new ramps? And this is an interesting sort of U.S. Political conservation issue here, which is we offered to put together a safe harbor agreement. So which is an agreement under the Endangered Species Act, where if you do something good for an endangered species, you're actually not obligated to keep it forever. You only have to keep it the term of the agreement. Whereas if you don't have a safe harbor agreement and you invite an endangered species onto your property, then it's protected by federal law and you have to leave it. And so they're like, no, we don't need a safe harbor. And because I had said, you know, the habitat's going to be sort of separated by 1,200 feet of really inhospitable habitat from an occupied site for the butterfly. If we wanted them back, we'd probably have to reintroduce them because they're notoriously sedentary butterflies. You know, just hang around this one species, one flower head, you know, their entire life. And so they're like, yeah, no safe harbor, we're all good. And even if they show it, so fast forward 3 years, and boom, there's butterflies everywhere. And so we've got this site now, and so we did an acre, and then this Beach Bluffs Restoration Project did another 3 acres, and now you can drive to this beach in the summer when the butterfly flies, and people literally will hit them with their car doors as they're parking and walking down the slope to the beach, and they have no idea that's an endangered species that they just encountered. And it worked out pretty well because there was sort of no other use of this slope than to have it landscaped. And after we got over the cranky people saying we want roses and we want it to be green all the time, it's been sort of a rousing success, and just I think incrementally has decreased the probability of extinction of that species.
That's awesome.
That's really cool. Other than the car doors smashing into them and people,
I know, they're fine. There's
unknowingly breaking federal laws, I suppose.
Oh, here's the thing. If you go out and you survey for them and you know what they are, you have to get a permit because you're harassing them. But if you just walk down the slope on the way to the beach and have the exact same impact, you don't have to do anything because you have no idea what you're doing.
Oh, ignorance is bliss in this case.
Ignorance makes it legal.
Yeah.
There are signs, but I've learned people don't read. Even deans don't read. My dean excluded, of course.
Oh man, well, that's really good. I mean, LA has obviously had a lot of press in the last few years for all these crazy finds. New species living within LA, whether they're flies or various other things. As well as butterfly reintroductions and like you're just telling us. And people wouldn't maybe necessarily think of that because LA is a bit of a sprawling metropolis that happens to be in a very biodiversity rich location.
This is a really interesting point, right? So the flies that were found, I was an advisor to that project, and on the sort of location and traps and getting some of the spatial data to analyze those things. And this is the sort of ecology in, ecology of the city. There's such things that we don't know about, right? Are these native phorid flies that are simply we're catching now and figuring that out? Are they from other places? What is the sort of natural flora of these areas? Are they now on the exotic plants that we have there, or have we totally replaced them? And we did a thing where another little restoration. It was more a guerrilla art project than a restoration. We planted native plants in the city strip between the sidewalk and the street as part of a public art thing in a neighborhood, and it was supposed to also help clean up the hydrocarbons in the soil because this was a neighborhood that had an oil field since 1910 or something like that. And I was studying phytoremediation with native plants because that was my one good idea for that year. And and so we put these up there and did a bunch of vac trap sampling with an entomologist from Riverside named Ken Osborne, and we started looking at them. And it turns out that the dominant species on our little native plants were the exact same ones that are dominant on those species of native plants out in the coastal sage scrub, several miles, tens of miles out into the urban wildland interface. And so for tiny little things that can fly, it's remarkable what you can actually attract and support in a neighborhood like that.
Yeah, it's crazy.
I was just thinking about this, what you were saying about the sort of hidden biodiversity of cities, and you mentioned earlier about you did some work on effects of artificial lighting, and people often think about artificial lighting in terms of the baby turtles going the wrong way on the beach and stuff, but presumably in cities there must be all these effects on all these animals and plants as well that we don't really know about. So how can you study that and figure out what effects this is happening? Right.
So yeah, the lighting thing, people tend to start with the ones that leave dead bodies, right? Towers and turtles and whatnot. But insects attracted to lights. And so, Catherine Mitch and I convened this conference in 2002 on artificial lighting, and also then did a book that came out of the conference in 2006. And recently, I've done some work. It was actually a student-led project with Philips Lighting to look at insect attraction to lights that are intended for use indoors. And looking at ways to configure the spectrum of those lights to minimize insect attraction, with the idea they would be deployed in the tropics, in places that don't have a lot of glass used or screens used. And so the way that you can go about doing this is, yeah, we went out and set up traps, one set of traps at the UCLA campus. This was one of the last projects I did when I was teaching for them a few years ago. And then out in the Santa Monica Mountains, which goes to your point earlier about what an incredibly biodiverse place Los Angeles really is. You can drive to a whole bunch of different native habitats very quickly. It's sort of a biogeographer's dream in that respect. And then we configured the lamps using some software that Philips provided for them to minimize the emissions at the predicted levels, the wavelengths that are predicted to be most attractive to insects by these two old papers that are like the only papers out there that actually have a full spectrum for attraction. And so we were able to take and show that for the same color temperature, if you're not familiar with it, color temperature is the way that you describe the character of light relative to what color it would be if you heated up a black body to that color temperature. So a incandescent bulb is 2700 Kelvin. One of the cool LED bulbs might be 4,000 or 5,000 Kelvin, so much a bluer look. And the odd thing is that the higher the color temperature, the colder it looks because there's more blue, right? So blue hot makes it look cold. All right, you following me?
Yeah.
All right,
there we go.
So,
It's a real lesson.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
I know what you want. So we were able to configure the same color temperature, 2700 color temperature, and with a compact fluorescent and with LEDs, off-the-shelf LEDs, and then custom LEDs, and show that the compact fluorescent attracts more insects, the off-the-shelf LED, and then the custom LED, all the same color temperature, but different emission spectra. And so this is one of the ways that you can go about and study these things. And this then required a lot of student hours, a lot of sorting of a lot of sorting, or grad student hours, depending on what's going on. A lot of sorting of insects, but then to crunch those numbers down and show that we can have lighting that is better for people and wildlife, and can potentially reduce insects that are vectors from being attracted and all those sorts of things.
And that obviously has applications in non-tropical cities as well. If you were to shift, city lighting or whatnot to these spectra that are less attracting to insects, then you have less impact, perhaps, or theoretically on local insects for their benefit.
Right, and cities across the United States and the UK are facing this right now, where they're replacing old outdoor roadway lighting systems with new ones, either metal halide, which are very blue, or LEDs, where they're picking sort of the bluer end of the spectrum, and that is something we're been active, sort of. Let's say just promoting the idea that there's an ecologically sound way, and it isn't to replace these lights that generally are very low in blue output, that's both very attractive to insects and is right in the middle of the melatonin action spectrum, which is where circadian impacts come in. So if you guys are familiar with a high pressure sodium lamp, the ones that look kind of orange, that are very common across the globe now for street lighting, that has actually very little blue light in it, whereas the LEDs that are being replaced with, that are say 4200 Kelvin LED, have a nice peak right in the insect. Well, it's not the insect attraction so much because they're more in the ultraviolet, but they like the blue too. But the melatonin is right there as well, and so the melatonin gets into both human circadian rhythms and animal circadian rhythms. And so there's this great paper, actually there's a couple of great papers that came out in the last year showing effects on melatonin levels, hormones that are produced at night in the wild for birds and for marsupials. A study out of Australia and one out of Glasgow or somewhere. And so, but both showing that these aren't just imaginary things where we're exposing animals in the lab, but it's actually happening in the wild. And with the marsupials, these are wallabies that were having their whole reproductive cycle desynchronized by exposure to the lights at night on this military installation, compared to the ones that are out in the bush and not exposed to lights at night.
Wow, that's crazy.
These are really incredible studies, like in-depth things that cover so many aspects.
Right, and you'll note that what I'm doing there is synthesizing, because those are two people. This has sort of become my role as in this field. I mean, some of this research, obviously that I've done, but it's also kind of paying attention and integrating across lots of people and being there, because part of my job is, I see it also as being a communicator, and so my conference schedule isn't just meetings where I'm presenting, basic research. I'm going to go to Light Fair this year, which is like the biggest lighting expo in North America, which I'm going to be the one ecologist at Light Fair.
You'd probably be the most. Everyone will be like, "Whoa, did you meet this guy?"
Yeah, and go to the landscape architecture meetings and work with lighting designers and lighting engineers who are coming at it with a slightly different realm, but we're getting these ideas out into the hands of the people who can make a difference. And that, for me, is really the motivating reason to be a scientist. This is another reason I'm a crappy biologist. I should be happy just to figure out how things work, but I really want to take these ideas and push them out and get them applied. So the tower kill stuff, that went directly into rulemaking for the federal government in the United States around lighting on communication towers. Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit about that? So I assume we're talking about like cell phone towers and stuff like that have got, the really tall, thin towers that have got the flashing lights at the top. And those are, I presume, not good for birds and or other animals that are flying into the towers?
Right. So it's actually not cell phones. Cell phone towers tend to be much shorter. And people use cell phone towers as a shorthand, and there are issues, at least with some evidence that there's issues with cell towers and birds and bird reproduction. But let's set that aside for a minute. What I'm talking about are tall communication towers of radio television. So these things that are 600, 800, 1,000, 1,500 feet in the air. And this was one of these meta studies, because we took and gleaned through all of the old, regional, local papers saying, I went out to the tower and I recorded this number of birds of these species over this number of years. And there are a ton of studies like that, and they sort of range from one season to 29, 39 years that people obsessively went out every night and looked underneath the towers for the dead birds. And the way that it works is, for reasons that I think we have a sort of handle on, but we're not exactly positive, nocturnally migrating songbirds are unable to orient when they encounter steady burning lights on towers, and they don't have a view of the stars. So what we think goes on is they're kind of attracted to the lights maybe as a sort of a supernatural thing. They're pushed downward in their supernatural stimulus. In other words, nothing like it in nature at this, evolutionarily. And then they're pushed downward in their altitude so that they encounter the towers more with storms, because there's very much higher mortality after storms. And then they end up circling the towers and not wanting, sort of anthropomorphized, but not leaving that sort of zone of attraction. And then they collide with the towers, and the literally, kilometers of guy wires, these big wires that hold these tall towers up. So there's a correlation with the steady burning lights, the height of the tower, and the fact that towers over a certain height are always going to be held up by guy wires. And there was this estimate of the number of birds that were killed at towers that goes back to 1979, the Fish and Wildlife Service, which was based basically on 3 data points. One tower in Florida and 2 in South Dakota. And then they're like, and we estimate that half towers kill birds, and there's this number of towers, time that rate, and boom, our estimate is, whatever it was, 4 million, 2 million birds a year. And then somebody updated it by the number of new towers. And we thought, yeah, we can probably do better than that. Especially since there's this regulatory proceeding going on with the Federal Communications Commission, and so we got together all these data, and we did an estimate that is still a sophisticated back-of-the-envelope estimate, but it is based on a whole heck of a lot more data points and has been put through the statistical ringer a whole bunch more than the 1979 estimate. And that led to ultimately an estimate of 6.8 million birds per year. And then we took all the lists of birds by region and said, these are the species that this is likely, affecting. And here are the species that are likely being affected disproportionately to their abundance. And it confirmed things that people already knew, but put some estimates to them. Nocturnal migrants, species of special concern, and whatnot. And so that then gets put into the record, and the tower industry hires some consultants to rip up our papers and say how horrible they are, but then they don't bother publish anything that actually rips it up, and we take their critiques and make the papers better before they actually go to final publication. And now the FCC and the FAA just last month have jointly said it's okay, and we encourage tower operators to turn off the solid lights on towers and just leave the flashing ones. And because the research is Joelle Gehring, who's now the biologist for the FCC, her research showed in an experiment, if you just turn off those solid lights and save money by not having to illuminate those solid lights, you can reduce mortality by 50 to 80%, or 60 to 70%, depending on what kind of confidence intervals you like. So now, that's what they're encouraging, and it's now a win-win after the industry got done hiring people to rip it up. Now they realize they can save some money on it.
That's fantastic, and a lesson to us all that if you want to have any real impact, then finding a way to make it financially prudent for someone else is a good thing.
Yeah, and things can't always be financially prudent. And the other thing to remember is if you have anything that has financial impact, be prepared to be attacked by for-hire statisticians, right, who are willing to tear everything down but never suggest an improvement.
And just use those suggestions before you send in your final version.
It doesn't hurt. They're like, oh, well, you didn't consider, that you back transformed after such and so, and you need to use the smearing estimator to do this or that. And I'm like, okay. And so I go back and I use the smearing, and I'm like, look at that. Estimate just went up.
You should put a cheeky acknowledgement in next time.
You know what? I don't remember if I did. We might have put a cheeky acknowledgement in there. Yeah.
Perfect.
So before we finish, Morgan alluded earlier to the fact that you came to our attention with a piece that you'd written that was published on Medium about the current occupation of the wildlife reserve in Oregon. So maybe if any of our listeners don't know about this, you can give a little overview of what's happening and what your piece was about.
Sure. For those of you who haven't heard, we have people much in the western part of the United States, but not exclusively, who question the right of the federal government to own land and chafe under the fact that some western states have over half of the land owned by the federal government. And some of these folks are notorious scofflaws in terms of not paying their grazing fees because they're grazing their cattle on federal land, even though the grazing fees are 14 times lower than what the market would actually bear. They just fundamentally don't believe in the federal government's right and to manage these lands and to own them, even to own them. And so a bunch of them also quote unquote patriots and they have a lot of weapons, frankly, and they had a protest a few weeks ago in which they ended up the protest by taking their weapons to a wildlife refuge and occupying the place. By occupying it, I mean they brought supplies and have settled in and have now basically taken it over. And the thing is, it's in Oregon. It's a wildlife refuge that ironically has a very close and strong relationship with the local ranchers and actually involves some limited ranch grazing as a management tool on the wildlife refuge. And all these occupiers, or most of them, are from out of state. And the thing that ground my gears about this is I read this article where they had set up in the office of the fisheries scientist on this refuge and were on her desk, her research materials, her stuff, And we're kind of picking through that and then telling the media how, she is what's wrong with America and that she's not helping America. And it's all based on this idea that all these lands should be private and people should be able, in their view, probably do as much extractive uses as possible, right? And that got me a little bit upset, and I was thinking about it because a wildlife refuge, it's not like they stormed the federal building, right? They took over a wildlife refuge, and it got me thinking about where wildlife refuges came from. And they came out of the early days of the 1900s when there was a crisis of conservation, and the quills and the birds on hats thing was in full force, and Teddy Roosevelt recognized that if we hunted everything and killed everything everywhere all the time, there wouldn't be enough for future generations. And so wildlife refuges got established, and also that's sort of around the time you get the emergence of scientific wildlife management, and that refuges have always been places that have as their highest aspirations, whether or not there's ever a political decision made, of course there are, but these are places that are built on the sort of North American model of wildlife management and of wildlife management science, and places that do research. And so some of the great breakthroughs of modern wildlife science and management have come out of science done on refuges. And as I mentioned in the piece, I know this because my father was I think it was probably 40 years by the time he was done, but he was a federal wildlife biologist, worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service and then the USGS when they went over, and did his work on refuges. And I have these names of refuges in my head, Patuxent Wildlife Refuge. This is the place that basically got DDT banned because they did the research. And my dad testified in that court proceeding. These are the places that studied lead shot and whether steel shot would kill birds instead, and so that we could stop killing birds with lead shot. These are the places that are the as I wrote in the piece, they're sort of secular shrines to scientific management, and that's the whole point of the place. And now scientific management also has adaptive resource management and stakeholder involvement and all these sorts of things. So to have these armed occupiers who for some bizarre reason have not yet been arrested sitting there in a national wildlife refuge, to me, and so the title of the piece that I wrote was I Stand with Linda Sue Beck, because this isn't just an attack on the government, this just isn't anti-government, these are people who are anti-science, and this anti-scientism, this anti-intellectualism is really rampant right now, and we see it across any number of areas in society where people just don't want to hear what the science says if it doesn't fit their political beliefs. And we know from psychology that's what people do. They discount evidence that doesn't support their beliefs. But that's why we have processes put in place to manage our public lands that depend on science, and also a regulatory process where you actually have to defend things. If somebody doesn't agree, you can take them to court. But the thing is, they don't want any science. They don't want to know these things. They want to do what they want to do, and they think that scientists, and this is the other thing that got me, is this view that people who work for the government are cancers on society. The thing is, they're not. These are people who have middle-class jobs with retirements, who are on the PTA, whose kids go to local schools, who contribute to the stability of some of these rural communities that, to be quite honest, can be often sort of economically disadvantaged or otherwise marginalized. And having employment, being a biologist is a job. It's a career. Being a manager, a wildlife manager, is a job and a career that contributes to and stabilizes and has a public good. And to have people go in and sit in somebody's personal effects and then denigrate the entire position of being a scientist, and the idea that everybody who works for the government, whether it's state or federal or whatnot, is not contributing to society, is what's wrong with America. Yeah, I got a little cranky.
I would die if anyone sat at my desk. I thought about it. If you think about your desk, like towards the end of when you're going to defend your PhD and how you've amassed all these little things and pieces of data, and if anyone would ever sit at my desk, they're like, no, I just, there were no chairs in the other room, don't worry, I didn't touch anything. And when I read the piece, I felt for her so much. Some person who's so against like everything she believes in and works for, and has dedicated her life to, and is sitting at her desk and touching her stuff and ripping it all apart. It's atrocious.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's just, and because it's personal for me, I wanted to say something, and looking back, there's a few things where I might have been a little more nuanced about, the actual situation and whatnot. But, at some point, you spend as a scientist, or me as a bad scientist, you have to, stand up to peer review and be exact and be all about the facts and whatnot. And I just wanted to say something and share it and let people know that, there's others out here who see what's going on and are thankful for people who are out there and putting their careers and hearts and minds into taking care of things that are held in public trust. So that's where I was.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've gone over it. There's no real easy way anybody can justify what's going on there, and or the response. To be frank, the government, local, state or federal government's response to what's happening, in any way. And as two out of the three hosts of the show aren't Americans or American residents. We're mostly, I am sure, just looking at situations going on, especially in a political year for you guys, and just shaking our damn heads, going, "What is going on?"
Yeah.
Pull yourself together, America, because you're looking at it.
Well, I think there's some political considerations.
In Oregon. It's close enough to Canada. People might just go. You never know.
I hope that there's a grand plan. There are some political considerations of not wanting a bloodbath, and I've gotten some tweets from people who are local, who are, and I've got nothing but support except for the people who say the government can't own land, period, and then I just ignore those. But there's someone who's saying, basically the hills have long eyes. They're keeping track of exactly what's going on out there. They're taking pictures. They're keeping notes. I think the political history of Ruby Ridge and Waco and whatnot makes the federal government very hesitant here to go in with a tank. So I can only hope that there's a plan. But certainly there's plenty of people who support the idea that this needs to get shut down and needs to let people get back to what they should be doing, and to preserve the scientific integrity of the records and materials and whatnot that's there, especially at a refuge that's an example of good collaborative adaptive management with the community.
Yeah. I particularly feel bad for any grad students who are coming up and planning their spring field season and not knowing whether their field site is going to be occupied by a bunch of asshats.
Right? Like, you always hear someone giving their talk and they're like, "Oh, there's a flood the next field season." Yeah. It's not like, "Oh, some weird militia creep asses took over our spot,"
Yeah.
My notebook was stolen.
Yeah, there's going to be some interesting methods papers or methods sections coming up in the next few years and explaining gaps in data because of douche canoes, but we'll see how those go in a couple of years, I guess. Well, I guess we're pretty much out of time. We'll end it there on a fairly cranky and terrible note, but on a bright prospect for the future, perhaps.
Yeah, thank you for writing that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I think a lot of people appreciate it, as you said, and even if they aren't able to speak up, it was nice to have something to point people to that I think expressed a lot of people's shared opinions.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, on the platforms that I know I can track, I think we reached over 75,000 people in a couple of days, and they continue on a little bit. So it never had anything like that happen before when I'm talking about cryptic biodiversity in Los Angeles. But let's hope that it opens the room for discussion about the sort of rampant anti-intellectualism that's going on just a little bit further, and specifically anti-science, strain that needs to be called out and identified for what it is.
Excellent. Well, you may not get a population of 75,000 people listening to this, but where people that are listening follow along with what you're doing, both in relation to your research, which is obviously super fascinating and relevant to a lot of people, as well as all of your other thoughts and ideas and projects going on.
I tweet a little bit. It's just my name at Travis Longcore. And I have a website that I posted this on called travislongcore.net. And then you're welcome to seek me out however you wish.
That's a dangerous thing to say.
By your door.
Yeah, I have an office on a secure floor, so within reason, I welcome hearing from people.
Awesome. For everybody that's listening at home, we'll have links to all of Travis's stuff, including his editorial I Stand with Linda Sue Beck, and some of his other work, including his website, on our website, which is at breakingbio.com. As well, you can always follow us online on Twitter at Breaking Bio, on Facebook by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast, and you can always take us with you if you want to listen to all of our back episodes, which we're getting quite a column for. Now we're coming up on episode 100. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us, the Breaking Bio podcast there. And finally, we need to thank the European Society for Evolutionary Biology, who provided us some funding. So thank you very much, Travis, and I hope everybody at home joins us next week when we have a new guest.